The aroma of truffle oil and seared wagyu filled the air as Marco DeLuca stepped into the grand dining hall of Le Bernard. Chandeliers cast a golden glow over the polished mahogany tables, where New York's elite dined on exquisitely plated dishes. The sound of wine glasses clinking and hushed conversations created a melody of exclusivity, a world Marco had dreamed of belonging to since he was a boy. At 27, he had worked tirelessly in small kitchens, perfecting his craft with nothing but passion and an old notebook filled with his grandmother's handwritten recipes. This was supposed to be his moment, the opportunity to work under one of the most revered chefs in the industry, Richard Whitmore. Standing in the sleek, stainless steel kitchen, Marco presented his dish, handmade pappardelle with a slow-braised short rib ragu, topped with Parmigiano Reggiano aged 36 months. It was a dish born from tradition, from love. His hands were steady, his voice confident. I believe this represents everything fine dining should be: simplicity, authenticity, and Richard Whitmore, an aging chef in his late 50s, with a sharp jawline and eyes cold as steel, took a single bite. His expression didn't change. Then, he set his fork down with an air of finality. "You've got some skill," he admitted, swirling his wine. "But fine dining isn't for people like you." Marco's chest tightened. "I don't understand." Richard leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You belong in a food truck, not in a Michelin-starred restaurant." The words sliced through Marco deeper than any chef's knife. Silence. A slow, mocking chuckle spread among the other chefs standing nearby, as if they were watching a stray dog begging for scraps. Marco clenched his fists, swallowing the humiliation burning in his throat. "Thank you for your time," he said, his voice steady. He turned, walking out of the kitchen without looking back. The laughter followed him, echoing through the hallways as he stepped into the cold night air. He had a choice: let their words define him or prove him wrong. That night, Marco made a promise to himself. They thought he belonged in a food truck? Fine. He'd build something even bigger. The night air was crisp as Marco stepped onto the empty streets of Manhattan. The distant hum of traffic and neon lights flickering against the wet pavement did little to drown out the sound of Richard Whitmore's voice echoing in his head. "You belong in a food truck." The words burned, but not with shame. No, Marco refused to feel that. Instead, something else stirred within him. Defiance. Determination. He had spent years learning every technique, perfecting every dish, and yet, in that pristine kitchen, he was nothing more than an outsider. Not because he lacked skill, but because he didn't fit the mold. Fine. If they wouldn't let him in, he'd build his own path. For weeks, he worked endless shifts at a rundown diner, scraping together every penny. Every tip, every late-night double shift, every hour spent sweating in a kitchen that smelled of burnt grease and disappointment, he funneled it all into one thing: a dream. Then, finally, he found it, a battered, second-hand food truck parked in a scrapyard on the outskirts of Queens. The paint was peeling, the tires barely held air, and the engine coughed like a lifelong smoker. It was a disaster. It was perfect. Marco spent every spare second restoring it. He sanded down the rust, repainted the exterior in bold, classic Italian red, and installed a small but efficient kitchen. The first time he stood inside, running his hands over the steel countertops, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. But hope wasn't enough to fill a food truck with customers. Opening day was brutal. The few people who did stop by barely glanced at the menu before walking away. "Why would I pay for pasta from a truck?" one man scoffed. "Food trucks are for burgers and tacos, not fancy Italian food," another muttered. By the third day, Marco had barely made enough to cover gas. Doubt crept in. Maybe Richard was right. Maybe he didn't belong in fine dining, hell, maybe he didn't belong anywhere. But just as the thought took hold, an older woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes approached the window. "I'll have whatever you recommend," she said with a smile. Marco hesitated, then nodded. Minutes later, he handed her a steaming bowl of pappardelle with slow-braised short rib ragu, the same dish Richard Whitmore had dismissed. The woman took a bite. Then another. Then she closed her eyes, her expression softening with something Marco hadn't seen before. Recognition. This, she murmured. This tastes like home. She took a photo of her meal and left, but by the next morning, something unexpected happened. Marco's phone buzzed. Then again. And again. A food blogger had posted a review. A glowing review. By lunchtime, the line at his truck stretched around the block. The lunch rush was unlike anything Marco had ever experienced. What had started as a single glowing review had turned into a wildfire. People weren't just coming for the food, they were coming for his food. The woman from the previous day had been no ordinary customer. She was Eleanor Hayes, a retired but highly respected food critic who had once written for the New York Times. Her post on social media had sent food lovers swarming to Marco's little red truck, eager to taste the dish she had described as a love letter to real Italian cooking. By noon, Marco was moving faster than ever, tossing fresh pasta into boiling water, stirring slow-simmered sauces, and shaving generous curls of Parmigiano over steaming plates. His hands ached, sweat dripped down his back, but he didn't care. Every order shouted. Every dish plated. Every customer leaving with that same expression, the one that said this is special. By the end of the day, he had sold out completely. And the next day. And the day after that. But with success came new challenges. The crowds grew bigger. The lines longer. The demand greater than he could handle alone. He hired a second cook. Then a third. He expanded the menu, sourcing the best ingredients he could afford. Then one evening, a man in a tailored suit approached as Marco was closing up. "You're the talk of the city," the man said, adjusting his cufflinks. "Ever thought about opening a real restaurant?" Marco wiped his hands on his apron and looked at him. "This is a real restaurant." The man smirked. "I mean something bigger. Investors are watching you. You could have a permanent location, one with walls, chandeliers, a full staff. The whole fine dining experience." For a moment, Marco imagined it. A restaurant with his name on the door. A kitchen filled with chefs trained under him. A place that wasn't mobile, wasn't temporary. But then he glanced back at his truck, the same truck he had rebuilt from the ground up, where every dish served carried a piece of his journey. "I appreciate the offer," Marco said, "but I'm not done here yet." The man's smile faltered. "This kind of fame doesn't last forever. You should strike while the iron's hot." Marco shook his head. "If what I'm doing is real, it won't burn out. Good food doesn't need walls. It just needs people who believe in it." The man sighed, slipping a business card into Marco's hand before walking away. Marco didn't need it. He already knew what came next. He wasn't going to chase fine dining. Fine dining was going to come to him. The night was quiet as Marco leaned against his food truck, exhaustion settling deep in his bones. The last plate had been served, the last pan scrubbed clean, and the streetlights cast long shadows over the empty sidewalk. He should have felt victorious. After all, he had done what no one thought he could. The food truck that people once dismissed as a joke was now the place to eat in New York. Lines stretched around the block every night. Food bloggers, critics, and even a few celebrities had sung his praises. And yet, something gnawed at him. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through the flood of articles and social media posts about his truck. They called him a visionary, a rebel, a game-changer in the culinary world. But none of that erased the memory of Richard Whitmore's words. "You belong in a food truck." Marco had proven him wrong. But had he really? Richard still ruled the world of fine dining, still wore his Michelin stars like armor, still sat in judgment over who deserved to cook in his pristine kitchen. Marco had spent years believing he didn't need validation from people like Richard. But now, for the first time, he wanted it. Not because he needed their approval. Because he wanted to shake the foundations of their world the same way they had shaken his. The next morning, Marco made a call. 2 weeks later, a black and gold food truck rolled into the heart of Manhattan's fine dining district, directly in front of Le Bernard. The sign on the side was simple. Pasta from a food truck, by Marco DeLuca. At first, the city's elite sneered. Fine dining patrons wrinkled their noses at the thought of street food sitting outside one of the most exclusive restaurants in the world. But curiosity is a powerful thing. One by one, people started trying his food. And they kept coming back. A month in, Marco's truck was busier than the Michelin-starred restaurant behind it. 2 months in, a New York Times food critic wrote, "The best Italian food in the city isn't served on white linen. It's handed to you in a paper bowl from a man who understands that true fine dining isn't about chandeliers, it's about soul." And then, one night, the doors of Le Bernard opened, and a familiar figure stepped out. Richard Whitmore. He stood there for a long moment, watching the line of people wrapped around Marco's truck. Marco met his gaze. He could see it, the flicker of realization in Richard's eyes. The understanding that he had been wrong. This wasn't just a food truck anymore. This was a revolution. For weeks, Richard Whitmore watched from a distance as Marco's food truck continued to dominate the fine dining scene. At first, he dismissed it. A trend. A passing fascination. But the numbers didn't lie. Le Bernard's reservations were dropping. Once, there had been a 6-month waiting list. Now, the restaurant was struggling to fill tables on a Friday night. Worse, customers who had once been his most loyal patrons were now standing in line outside a food truck, eating pasta from biodegradable bowls with plastic forks. It was an insult. It was a wake-up call. The Michelin inspectors came. For years, Le Bernard had held 3 stars, the highest honor in the culinary world. But the food hadn't evolved, the atmosphere had grown stale, and, most damning of all, customers were no longer excited to dine there. When the new Michelin guide was released, Le Bernard had lost a star. The news sent shockwaves through the industry. Investors panicked. Reviews turned brutal. And in the heart of the chaos, Richard Whitmore was called into a private meeting with the restaurant's owners. "This is a disaster," one of them said, throwing the Michelin report onto the table. "We need to modernize. We need fresh vision. We need someone the public actually wants to eat from." Richard's jaw clenched. "You're saying I'm the problem?" The owner slid a folder across the table. Richard opened it. Inside was a name. Marco DeLuca. "We want him," the owner said. "He's got the influence, the talent, and the audience we need. If anyone can bring this restaurant back, it's him." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. They were asking him to bring back the man he had humiliated. Worse. They were asking him to beg. That evening, Richard stood outside Marco's food truck, the same way Marco had once stood in his kitchen all those years ago. The crowd was thick, the scent of garlic and slow-braised meat filling the air. Laughter. Conversation. The unmistakable hum of a place that people wanted to be a part of. Richard stepped forward. Customers moved aside. And then Marco saw him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Richard inhaled sharply and said the words he had never imagined himself saying. "I need your help." Silence. Marco crossed his arms. "With what?" Richard swallowed hard. "Le Bernard is failing. They want you to consult. To help bring it back to life." Marco didn't respond right away. He let the moment stretch, watching the way Richard shifted uncomfortably under the weight of his own words. Then, finally, he leaned in slightly, his voice calm. "I thought I belonged in a food truck." Richard exhaled, the humiliation written across his face. "I was wrong." It wasn't just an admission. It was defeat. Marco could say no. He could walk away and watch Le Bernard crumble under its own arrogance. But he didn't. Instead, he wiped his hands on his apron and said, "I'll help, on my terms." Richard frowned. "And what are those?" Marco's smile was slow, deliberate. You work for me. Richard's face paled. You want me to be your employee? Marco shrugged. Call it what you want. But if I'm going to save Le Bernard, I want you in the kitchen, cooking under my lead. Just like you once expected me to cook under yours. Richard hesitated, but he had no choice. And so, for the first time in his career, the great Richard Whitmore put on an apron and took orders from the very man he had once humiliated. The student had become the master. And the food truck chef had just taken over fine dining. The air inside Le Bernard was heavy with silence. Richard Whitmore sat at the long mahogany table in the private dining room, his fingers steepled as he listened to the restaurant's owners list off their concerns. Declining revenue. Poor customer retention. The Michelin downgrade. It was everything he had fought his entire career to avoid, and now it was crashing down around him. We need something drastic, one of the executives said, flipping through the latest financial reports. We need a new face. Someone who understands modern dining, someone the public respects. Richard already knew what was coming. Marco DeLuca, another voice said. The name felt like a blade between his ribs. Richard clenched his jaw, his pride warring with the undeniable truth. Marco had become what he once was. A force. A name that carried weight. The owners weren't asking. They were demanding. We need you to convince him to help us, one of them added. Richard exhaled slowly. So that was it. After all these years, after all his accomplishments, he was being sent to beg the very man he had humiliated. That night, Richard walked through the city, hands in his coat pockets, until he found himself outside Marco's food truck. He had never set foot near it before. Never acknowledged its existence. But now, standing there, watching the endless line of customers waiting for their orders, he realized something that cut deeper than he expected. This was what success looked like. Not chandeliers. Not linen tablecloths. Not silent dining rooms where people whispered over overpriced entrees. Success was this: the smell of fresh basil and garlic, the sound of people laughing, the warmth of a meal served with soul. The realization stung more than it should have. Taking a deep breath, Richard stepped forward. The crowd parted slightly as he approached the small service window. And then Marco saw him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, Marco leaned casually against the counter, wiping his hands on a towel. To what do I owe the honor? He said smoothly. Richard hesitated. The words felt foreign in his mouth, but he forced them out. I need your help. A slow smile spread across Marco's face, but there was no warmth in it. Only understanding. I see, he said. And what exactly do you need help with? Richard's pride twisted like a knife in his chest, but there was no escaping this. Le Bernard is in trouble. We need fresh direction. Marco tilted his head slightly. You mean you need fresh direction? Richard swallowed. Yes. Silence stretched between them, heavy and weighted with the years of resentment, the unspoken words, the power shift that had finally come full circle. Then Marco exhaled, setting the towel down. All right, he said. I'll help. Richard blinked, caught off guard. You will? Marco nodded. On one condition. Richard braced himself. What is it? Marco leaned in slightly, his voice lower now. You work for me. The color drained from Richard's face. You want me to? Marco held up a hand, stopping him. No special treatment. No executive titles. If I'm going to fix your restaurant, I need you in the kitchen. As a chef. No more hiding behind a name. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. He wanted to refuse. Every fiber of his being wanted to walk away. But he couldn't. He had no choice. After all these years, he was back where he had started. Only this time, he wasn't the mentor. He was the student. Richard Whitmore had never felt so out of place in a kitchen before. For decades, he had commanded fine dining brigades with a single glance. Chefs had rushed to meet his demands, sous chefs had feared his judgment, and diners had revered his creations. But here, in his own restaurant, under Marco's leadership, he was nothing more than another pair of hands. And Marco made sure he knew it. On his first night back in Lou Bernard's kitchen, Richard found himself at the lowest station, prepping ingredients, slicing onions, and hand-rolling pasta. No executive privileges. No decision-making power. Just hard work, the kind he hadn't done in years. It was humiliating. It was infuriating. And yet, as the hours passed, something unexpected happened. He started listening. Marco wasn't running Lou Bernard like the old fine dining kitchens Richard had ruled over. He didn't demand blind obedience. He collaborated. The atmosphere in the kitchen had changed. The tension, the fear, the hierarchy that had once defined Lou Bernard were gone. In its place was energy. The chefs moved with purpose, their ideas were heard, their voices mattered. There was laughter between orders, and even in the most intense moments of service, there was a sense of passion, something Lou Bernard had lost long ago. And then there was the food. Gone were the overcomplicated, pretentious dishes meant only to impress critics. Instead, the menu reflected authenticity, simple, bold flavors that spoke to people's souls. House-made pasta. Rich, slow-cooked sauces. Fresh ingredients sourced from local farmers. The restaurant that had once turned its nose up at Marco's food had now embraced it. And the city noticed. The buzz returned. Tables filled. Reservations booked out for months. The Michelin inspectors came back. And this time, they awarded Lou Bernard its third star again. One night, after the last order had been served, Richard found himself alone in the kitchen. He ran his hands over the steel countertops, the same ones he had once ruled over, now ruled by another man's vision. He had spent years fighting against change, believing that fine dining had to stay within its rigid traditions. But Marco had proved him wrong. Richard wasn't angry anymore. He was grateful. And for the first time in his life, he felt something he hadn't in a long time, liberation. He took off his chef's jacket, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter. When Marco walked in, Richard simply nodded. "It's yours now." Marco studied him for a long moment. Then, he extended a hand. Richard hesitated, then shook it. Not as rivals. But as equals. The next morning, Marco walked past Lou Bernard without stepping inside. He had done what he came to do. But his place wasn't there. He glanced across the street, where a familiar sight waited for him. His red food truck. People were already lining up. The smell of fresh pasta filled the air. Marco smiled to himself as he stepped inside, tying his apron. Fine dining had come to him. But in the end, he never needed it. Back inside Lou Bernard, Richard Whitmore sat at an empty table, staring at the dish in front of him. A bowl of pappardelle with slow-braised short rib ragout. The dish Marco had presented to him all those years ago. The one he had dismissed. He took a bite. And for the first time, he truly tasted it. It was perfect. And with that, he smiled, because he finally understood. At its core, this story isn't just about revenge, it's about resilience, reinvention, and proving your worth on your own terms. Marco's journey reminds us that true success isn't about fitting into someone else's standards, it's about defining your own. He could have let rejection break him, but instead, he turned it into motivation. And in the end, he didn't just prove Richard wrong, he changed the fine dining world forever. But now, we want to hear from you. What do you think about Marco's journey? Did Richard deserve his downfall, or do you think he had a valid reason for the way he treated Marco? What lesson did you take from this story? Comment below. If you liked this story and found it inspiring, type 2 in the comments. If you didn't enjoy it or thought it could have gone differently, type 7. And don't forget, if you love real, powerful stories like this one, hit that like button and subscribe to EN True Tales. Natalie brings you new, compelling stories every day, stories that make you think, feel, and see the world differently. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that could change the way you see success. We'll be reading your comments, so let's talk.